Hey gang, I am Jay, and today on Homemade Heroes we are going to be discussing the question, is the Cosmere RPG simply a Dungeons & Dragons 5e variant? While we do this, I am going to be going through the beta rules to see if we can find examples of similarities and differences between the Cosmere RPG and Dungeons & Dragons 5e. This means you don't have to look at muggins over here, and it also means that I can use the beta rules as a reference for this rambling diatribe. Hopefully it won't be too rambling, but let's see how things go. A scan through the Cosmere RPG beta rules seems to show that it draws heavily from 5e, and somewhat less so from other RPGs such as Pathfinder. Are there any novel or unique elements to the Cosmere RPG, and how far do these elements go? Is this truly a unique game system, or simply an opinionated variant of 5e, such as you'd find with Level Up Advanced 5e? I'm probably not going to be able to answer all these questions, but let's dive in and discuss the similarities and differences. First though, I do want to preface that I am a Cosmere fan. I own and have read most of Sanderson's adult fantasy novels. I've also supported the Kickstarter that just finished last week, and if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know that I love TTRPGs. The Cosmere RPG, bringing together the worlds and lore of Roshar and Scadrial in RPG form, is very exciting, not just to me, but to many other TTRPG and Cosmere fans. I am also a game master that runs 5e, Cairn, and Shadowdark games. Recently, I listened to Morris from EN World's podcast, and in the podcast, he discusses that Cosmere RPG does seem to draw rather heavily from D&D 5e. I wanted to explore that a little more, hence today's video. First, let's discuss the flow of play. As you can see here, the beta rules break down the flow of play into three main sections. The GM sets the scene, otherwise known as setting up a situation. The players decide what to do, and the GM narrates the results. So this is very similar to Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Basically the same as far as I can tell. I would also say though that this is the flow of many RPG games. So maybe not necessarily a direct borrow from D&D 5e. Another very similar element is rolling a skill test, which is described in the beta rules as the core mechanic of the game. This pretty much mirrors 5e, which calls for players to roll skill tests to see whether their characters are able to succeed at something or fail. You notice here over on the right of the page, it discusses advantage or disadvantage. This is also something that comes directly from 5e. Another really strong similarity is the item here called Specific Beats General. This is something that's also in 5e, which essentially says that when there is a specific talent or attribute or characteristic of a player or something in the game that beats the general guidelines or rules of the game as described, such as how to roll the dice or perform a skill test. It is notable that there have been some changes in wording in the beta rules compared to 5e. However, they also use a lot of familiar terms. An example of this is attributes. These are your character's 6 core characteristics, if you will. And as we can see here, they are strength, speed, intellect, willpower, awareness, and presence. Now these are different words or different terms than used in 5e for the most part, but they do correspond pretty strongly with the abilities in 5e. Expertise is something that looks the same as 5e, but is in fact a little different. Expertise in skills in 5e are mechanical in nature. They give modifiers to ability checks. However, in Cosmere RPG, the expertise is more of a narrative tool that perhaps assists your character in certain ways throughout the game. Items are another area that are very similar to 5e. We have a different monetary system, but we do have weapons that, as you can see, look pretty similar to the types of things we'd see in 5e. Melee weapons, ranged weapons. Weapons have traits. Here we see a weapon table, which looks very similar to something that we might see in 5e. Armor and equipment are two other things that have a lot in common with 5e. Here you see an equipment table, which gives the name of the item, the weight, and the price. Again, very similar to 5e. Something else that may look familiar to you if you're a 5e player or GM are the conditions. Some of these look almost exactly like the ones in the Dungeon Master's Guide, although there are a couple of different ones, such as empowered and enhanced. Here the beta rules talk about damage and damage type, something else that's no doubt familiar. And here we have injury effects, otherwise known as exhaustion. It does look like exhaustion in this instance is different to Dungeons & Dragons 5e, however. As you can see that exhaustion in the first two rows here indicate that there is a negative modifier to a roll, while lower rows in the table show that some of those conditions we looked at earlier are in place should this particular injury occur. I like that. It's a little more specific, and it does provide opportunities to roleplay injuries, which I think could be kind of cool. Another big similarity here is resting. As you can see, we have short rests, which look like they are an hour, and also long rests, which are 8 hours. Again, this is something that could be seen directly in 5e. And while I'm sure there are other things that we could find here, I do want to just quickly pop down to the monster stat blocks. Here's a quick look at the Axehound monster stat block, and you can see here that there's a description, some cultural information here, tactics that the Axehounds might use, and also a nice little stat block, which, if you're a 5e player or GM, particularly a GM, you'd be very familiar with. Obviously there are some differences, as the physical, cognitive, and spiritual elements here do provide different defenses, but a fairly familiar experience. Alright folks, that's a heck of a lot of similarities, but let's talk about the differences. I think the most obvious thing here is the plot die. This die is used when a GM asks for it, or if the GM agrees to a player's request to add it to a roll. This would typically be when the stakes are high. This 6-sided die offers the chance to roll an opportunity, which is a positive addition, a complication, a negative addition, or a blank, so no change to the result, which can affect the game narratively, or in the case of a complication, also provides a modifier to the roll result, a mechanical effect. The cool thing about this is it may help the roll to succeed, even while providing some sort of negative complication that is going to make things more challenging for the characters. The beta rules here go in to explain a little bit more about an opportunity and how you might spend such a thing. It's cool that you can use it yourself, or you can give it to another player. I really like that. It helps with teamwork in your party. And it's also really cool that the player gets to decide what the opportunity is. The complication, however, is the GM's decision. I do see using the plot die as overall a positive thing for the game. I do worry a little that it may slow the game down a bit, but I do think it adds opportunities for more complexity in the game's narrative. The next really unique thing about Cosmere RPG is the magic system. Sanderson fans relish the various interesting ways that magic imbues his worlds. In the Cosmere, spiritual energy, known as investiture, such as via Stormlight or Voidlight in Roshar. This is very different from the spells and spell slots used in 5e. There are 10 classes of Radiants, which are people that are able to use investiture in Roshar, and each class of Radiant is able to use this magical energy in different ways. This is obviously hugely different to 5e, and while I have read comments from people saying that they wish that the Cosmere had simply been adapted to 5e, I think this is a really good reason why it shouldn't have, as it would have become probably cumbersome and difficult to have the various systems of investiture in Sanderson's work moved over and adapted to 5e. I just don't think it would have worked very well. But if you disagree, please feel free to throw some comments down below, and I'd love to hear from you. The next two differences that I note are related to combat. The first one is the lack of an initiative roll. So initiative rolls in 5e happen at the start of combat. They essentially establish who is going to be acting first in combat, and that initiative order stays in place throughout the combat. In the Cosmere RPG, players decide when they want to act. They can either choose to act fast or act slow. If they choose to act fast, they get to go first in the order of combat, and they only get to use 2 actions. If they choose to go slow, they get to use 3 actions, but they have to wait until all of the players, NPCs, and adversaries that have gone fast. So essentially the order would be player characters fast, non-player characters and adversaries fast, player characters slow, NPCs and adversaries slow. So you get kind of 4 stages to a round of combat. This could definitely have ramifications for action economy, as those who get to go fast are potentially able to have more impact on the combat. Some smaller, unique mechanical items of note are for armor. There is the use of deflect. This is kind of a soak, where armor soaks up a certain amount of the damage rolled against that character, which is somewhat similar to how armor works in the game Cairn. Another element is focus. This is a mental resource that can be used to activate talents and reactions. And one final difference are the 3 defenses: physical, cognitive, and spiritual, which are used to set difficulty classes for when someone tries to test you, and are related to your character's 6 attribute scores. This is something that isn't seen in 5e, and I like the way it ties your character's attributes to their ability to defend against attacks from particular realms. As Morris notes, all of these rules, whether new or borrowed, are molded together in an elegant and comprehensive way in the beta rules. Now perhaps some of these things will change in the final version, but probably not significantly. The Cosmere RPG's strong similarity to 5e is actually a huge advantage, as 5e is the most commonly played TTRPG by a long shot, and will mean that the Cosmere will be very easy to transition to for all those 5e players out there. This may have been by design, and if so, a smart move on the part of the designers from Brotherwise Games. Either way, I think that the Cosmere RPG will be a great game, and I'm looking forward to my first game in the Cosmere. And I have to admit, I appreciate not having to learn a completely new set of rules in order to dive into the fantasy worlds of Brandon Sanderson that I love so much. Thanks for watching today, folks. Please leave any comments or questions down below, and farewell for now.